Hi everybody and good morning. My name is Liam for those of you that don't know me, and it is my privilege to be kicking off our new series in the Bible looking at the story of Ruth. So this is the first of 8 talks, so I'm going to keep this nice and brief. Being the first, I get to set the scene, but I don't need to worry about going into too much detail because those who come after me, like Anna next week and others, will fill in all the gaps and make up for my shortcomings. So hopefully you'll be able to find Ruth in a Bible if you've got it in front of you, but the words will be coming up on the screen. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. So when we start any story, it's really important that we set the scene, we know the context, the environment, the place, the characters. I don't know about you, but I love films, and I like films from all kinds of different genres. And the story of Ruth, it's a short story in the Bible, so it's really easy to read. But for me, if it were a film, it could be a Western, like something really gritty, like one of those old Westerns, or something post-apocalyptic, like Mad Max, but perhaps without some of the craziness. But you imagine that world that doesn't feel a million miles away from the world we know, but it's very different in other ways. It's quite bleak, the setting. It's things are not going well for the people of God at the start of Ruth. We begin by reading that there's a famine in the land, and the book of Ruth, it follows the book of Judges in the Old Testament. So Judges is where the people of God have come into the land, they've come into Israel, God's brought them out of the wilderness. But at the start of Judges, their great leader Joshua has died, and things don't go so well for the people of God during the book of Judges. Basically, people do whatever they want, they get into trouble with their enemies. So Judges goes from one battle to another, one disaster to another, and God's people are in real trouble, whether it's with the Philistines or various other enemies. But then God raises up these leaders called judges, people like Gideon, people like Samson, and like Deborah, who are great leaders who God uses to rescue his people, usually in battle. But then no sooner has that happened, then the people fall away, the judge, the leader dies, and then the next generation forget to follow God. They forget what God has done for them, and the cycle repeats again, and things go really badly. And then the last verse in the book of Judges says that at that time, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. So it's that kind of lawless thing you would expect from like a Mad Max film, where the security of being part of a strong nation and having a strong community, that's kind of getting stripped away, and the people are really vulnerable and in danger, and things are not looking so good. So again, when we start out in a new story, we want to establish who the main characters are. And with a story called Ruth, or a book in the Bible called Ruth, you'd expect that the main character is going to be somebody called Ruth, who you'd expect that we're probably going to meet quite early on. But that's not the case here. So we start with a man called Elimelech and his wife Naomi, who are part of the people of God. They live in Bethlehem, which was part of Israel. So they are part of the Jewish people, the people that follow the God of Israel, follow Yahweh. And they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And as a result of the famine that we've just heard about, Elimelech takes his family and leaves Bethlehem to go to Moab, which was not part of the people of God. It was not part of Israel. It was about a 50-mile journey from Bethlehem. So it's not an easy journey. And it was a place that was hostile to Israel. We don't think that Elimelech had any contacts there, but this is a case where there's such a disaster happening in the land, there's a famine, that he's taken the desperate decision to move his family away. So in terms of characters, that's what we're facing, a desperate people, a people who've faced real hardship and are doing whatever they can to try and survive. So we've spoken a little bit about the background and context. We know there's this famine that's happened. We've had a little look at the characters from the brief introduction that we've heard about them, but location is also really important. So we know that this story starts in Bethlehem, which I'm sure to most of us makes us think about the events that happened about 1,000 years later with the birth of Jesus, and we think of shepherds, wise men, and all of that. But yeah, in this context of Ruth, Bethlehem is one of the towns where the people of God have settled. And actually, the Hebrew language translation of Bethlehem is house of bread. So, place of bread, bakery, if you like. So, we don't know loads about Bethlehem, but I'm sure agriculture was really important. If you're going to call somewhere the house of bread, then it's probably a decent chance that grain plays a really important part in the community life, which, as we see later in the story of Ruth, it does. And maybe one of the reasons why this start of the story and the famine that is happening is such a shock when we think about where it's happening. So the place of bread has run out of bread. So I was going to use a loaf of bread as a prop at this point, but ironically enough, I went in the cupboard and we're out of bread. It's the end of the week. Pack-ups have exhausted our supplies, so we can't do that anymore. But there we go. But yeah, bread is really important in the Bible. At this time that we're looking at in the story of Ruth, the people would have looked back to when their forefathers were in the wilderness, when God brought them out of slavery in Egypt, and he provided manna from heaven, which was this miraculous bread. And what that was a really tangible picture and symbol of God providing for his people, which is what the story of Ruth is all about. Without giving too many spoilers away, it's God being the provider, the source of protection for his people, and the loving father who wants to rescue his people. The book of Ruth might not be as dramatic in terms of the events that happen in Exodus or Judges, where God rescues his people from great enemies, but they're facing as much of a challenge with this famine that happens. And in a more individual context, Naomi and Ruth are in such vulnerable positions as widows. Ruth, who we're going to meet next week, I'm sure, as a foreigner coming to the people of God. But God is the one who rescues. God is the one who redeems. It got me thinking too, back at the start of lockdown when restrictions first came in place, and I remember going to the supermarket and it just being such a weird experience to see empty shelves. And it was particularly the bread aisle, where there was literally nothing on the shelf. There was nothing. Clearly the supply chains, the flour and everything had all been bought up and wasn't making it to the shelves. And it was just such an odd thing to experience, probably for the first time in my life, what it looks like to be in a place where you can't just take what we need from a supermarket shelf if we've got the money to buy it. But it was impossible. There was nothing there. And for us, our son James is celiac, so he can't eat gluten. So the gluten-free section in the supermarket is really, really important for us. And we do our best to bake stuff at home and do what we can, but you're then relying on being able to get the ingredients. And I remember the flour, gluten-free flour, wasn't in the shops, no gluten-free pasta. And yeah, for me, that was just a tiny, tiny glimpse of what it means to not be able to access what we need. And I'll be honest, it kind of caused that bit of panic, that sense of dread that, I know that this isn't going to last forever. And yeah, about a week later, things were pretty normal again and the supermarket was well stocked, but it was just that tiny glimpse into, wow, what do we need? Where does it come from? Things aren't as automatic and certain as we seem. Okay, so now we do move back to the story of Ruth. So we know that Elimelech, Naomi and their sons have moved away from Bethlehem to Moab to find food. Presumably they've heard that there isn't a famine in Moab, or they're just desperate and it's all they can do in hope to try somewhere else and hopefully be able to survive. So we might think that at this point things are going to improve for our characters. Sadly, it's not the case. We read that Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi as a widow with her 2 sons. So in that context, being a widow was a really perilous position to be in without the support of a husband, especially being in a foreign land and not having that community around them. But at least Naomi has her sons, who by this point have also married local women. Things do then sadly get even worse. We read that Naomi's sons, within around 10 years, they also die. So now we are at rock bottom. Naomi has lost her husband, she's a widow, she's also tragically lost her sons, and she's left here with her daughters-in-law with nothing really to offer them. They've got little to offer her, and she very much is alone in a foreign land. Okay, so if the story ended there, then you'd be thinking, right, this is going to be pretty bleak, and the next 8 weeks are going to be pretty tough to have like an inspiring and helpful series of looking at the Word of God. So thankfully it doesn't end there. We are in a terrible situation in the story of Ruth. Things are looking really bleak, but even then there is a glimpse of hope in verse 6 when we read that Naomi hears that God has visited his people back in Israel. And so back in Bethlehem, it appears that the famine is over. God has provided food for his people, so that here we are, this glimmer of hope, which doesn't take away the fact that things have been really tough, and Naomi is a widow, she's without her sons, but she makes the decision, pretty much the only decision she can make, to return to Bethlehem, where God has visited his people, and be taken in by the community, and she prepares with her daughters-in-law to head back to Bethlehem. So that's where we start with the book of Ruth. We've got our characters, we've got our setting. We know that a dramatic and terrible event has happened. There's been a famine, there's death. Things are looking really bleak, but then there's hope. And as we go through the rest of the story, we're going to see what happens in the life of Naomi. And to be honest, the book should probably be called Naomi and Ruth, because it's very much as much about what God is going to do to redeem and save Naomi as it is about what he's going to do in Ruth, who I'm sure we'll meet properly next week. So there's despair, which turns to a glimmer of hope, and that's where we are. And I do just pray and hope that God's going to meet with us all during this book. But I think even in this introduction and these first few verses, we can sit back, we can ask ourselves what God would say to us today. And I really believe that the story of Ruth should make us think about where our provision comes from. Not just bread, not just the supermarket shop, though that is important. And God is as interested in the details and the small things in our lives, like where our food comes from, what we think about it, health, family, life, all these things that we always knew were important, but the recent events and recent months have just shown us how important they are. But in a wider sense than that as well, I think it really challenges me to think about, where does my provision come from? Where does my life come from? Where is the hope for my life? Do I look to God to give me what I need? Do I look to God to provide what I need in life? Or do I look elsewhere? Do I look to myself and my own strength and being able to do what I can do to achieve comfort, provision in life? Possibly sometimes. Do I look to other people? Definitely. Do we look to the government? Do we expect Boris Johnson and the government to have all the answers and to make sure that we can live our lives and nothing ever goes wrong? I think, again, recent events have shown that we can look to government with all kinds of hopes and expectations, even disappointments, and everybody has different views about what's going on. But it does show that we can always be looking outside of ourselves and feeling like somebody else should be answering our greatest needs and our greatest problems. So we can look to all kinds of different things: money, the world, power. But the book of Ruth, even though it's such a simple story, I think just brings us back to that fact that it is God. We need God. God is our hope. God is the one who provides. God is the only one who has the answers. The world of Ruth is a really hard world. The ancient world was. It was life and death were never too far apart. Famine, natural disaster, enemies were all around. And for those of us who live in comfort, like I would put my hand up and say we definitely do, these things can feel far off, but God is the same. And the world hasn't really changed. The world is still a difficult place at times. The world isn't as it should be, and we need to look to God and trust in him and believe that he is the author. He is the one behind the story. He is the one who can work through every situation, even the bleakest of situations, to turn things round, to redeem, to rescue. He has a plan and a purpose, and nothing is out of his control.